Okay, so we're continuing on with part two of the review of Dr. Ehrman's book, which is which I have right here. So he brings up a lot of interesting points about worship and how worship in the New Testament does not mean that Jesus is seen as God or any part of a Trinity, because let me get to the verse. Ehrman brings up an interesting point. He says that in Matthew chapter 18, verse 26, and kings were worshipped even in the Bible by veneration and obedience, just as God was. Here, Jesus may be accepting the worship due to him as the future king. None of these things is in itself a clear indication that Jesus is divine. So when people are worshiping Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, whatever, this is because Jesus is accepting worship due to him to him as the future king. Jesus is not accepting worship because he thinks he's God and his followers or the disciples think he's divine or God. Ehrman brings up a lot of good points or interesting points like this in his book. He says on page 127 of the book, How Jesus Became God, he says, he talks about the miracles of Jesus. He says in the Hebrew Bible, the prophets Elijah and Elisha did fantastic miracles, including healing the sick and raising the dead through the power of God. In the New Testament, so did the apostles Peter and Paul. But that did not make any of them divine. So when Jesus does miracles, well, so does, prophets of the Old Testament like Elijah, and the disciples like Peter did miracles too. So that doesn't make them divine. And he talks about Jesus forgiving sins. He says when Jesus forgives sins, he never says, I forgive you, as God might say, but your sins are forgiven, which means that God has forgiven the sins. So this concept of forgiving sins was otherwise reserved for Jewish priests in honor for sacrifices that worshippers made at the temple. For example, he says when Jesus forgives sins, he never says, I forgive you, as God might say, but your sins are forgiven, which means that God has forgiven the sins. So, there's a lot of good points that Ehrman brings up here, that forgiving sins is not an indication that you are God, or you're part of the Trinity or whatever. When Jesus was forgiving sins, nowhere in the Bible does it say that God is the only one who can forgive sins, or that Jesus is unique in forgiving sins. Because if you read the ending of the Gospel of John, the disciples were also allowed to forgive sins. So forgiving sins does not mean that you are God. Ehrman brings up a lot of interesting points like this in his book, which shows that even according to the New Testament, Jesus cannot be seen as God or equal to God, because of whatever Jesus does, it's found in other places in the Bible. So again, I'm going to be doing more videos on the book How Jesus Became God, but this is just some little pieces that Ehrman brings up in the book, which is good reasons to believe that Jesus is not God, even according to the theology of both the Old and New Testaments. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.